I see what you mean. Cause everything going on, you know it's wrong. Another day, another song. Good luck, Joe. Looking like a UFC. He didn't bother home.
By the way, Native Americans, you know this infamous problem with metabolizing alcohol. You know who else has that problem? The Chinese.
So it's an Asian issue.
Well, so you look at who populated North and South America before the land bridge. It's whoever was right at the edge of Asia. So Asians and the natives of North and South America have more in common with each other because of this than most other pairs of groups you might grab around the world.
Omaha on May 10th, 1869. It's estimated that 80% of the workers involved were Chinese. By 1870, all of the various racial taxes that were exclusive to Chinese immigrants made up about 25% of the state of California's total tax revenue, despite the total Chinese population making up less than 10% of the state's total population. But all of this hard work was not rewarded. In 1870, as part of a Reconstruction reform, Congress passed naturalization laws that allowed people of African descent to be eligible to become citizens, but specifically continued to exclude those of Chinese descent. And racial violence only continued to grow. In 1871, after an incident that led to the death of a white man working with the police in Los Angeles' Chinatown, a mob of approximately 500 white and Latino Americans murdered at least 19 Chinese immigrants, 15 by public hanging. Others were beaten and at least one person's finger was cut off to take a diamond ring. 10 people were charged, 8 were convicted, but all of the convictions were overturned on appeal due to a technicality. The Los Angeles Daily News wrote of the outcome in 1873. The convicted parties escaped full punishment for their crimes by a quibble. Justice is complacent, and the eagle roosts high. Thus it goes. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, functionally making immigration of Chinese women to the United States illegal. President Grant warned Congress of the evils of, quote, the importation of Chinese women, but few of whom were brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations. Those who wrote the law were able to cite the American Medical Association, which stated, quote, Chinese carried distinct germs to which they were immune, but from which whites would die if exposed. But the real reason for the law was the fear that under the new 14th Amendment, Chinese children born into America would be citizens. The hope was that if you prevented Chinese women from being able to come to the country, interracial marriage laws would prevent Chinese men from having children in America, and then they would return after providing cheap labor. But for many, this didn't go far enough. On July 23, 1877, an anti-Chinese riot broke out in San Francisco over several days. 4 Chinese were killed, and a large portion of Chinatown was burned to the ground. In 1878, Reno's entire Chinatown was burned to the ground. In 1879, California's state constitution was amended to add the prohibition of employment of Chinese people by state and local governments, as well as by businesses which were incorporated in California. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers for 10 years. This began what is now referred to as the driving out period. On September 2nd, 1885, approximately 150 armed white men, most of whom were members of the Knights of Labor, terrorized hundreds of Chinese miners and their families in Rock Springs, Wyoming. One witness gave this account. Whenever the mob met a Chinese, they stopped him and pointed a gun at him, asked him if he had any revolver, and then approached him. They searched the person, robbing him of his watch or any gold or silver that he might have about him, before letting him go. Some of the rioters would let the Chinese go after depriving him of all his gold and silver, while another Chinese would be beaten with the butt ends of the weapons before being let go. Some of the rioters when they could not stop a Chinese, would shoot him dead on the spot and then search and rob him. Others would overtake a Chinese, throw him down, search him, and rob him before they would let him go. Some of the rioters would not fire their weapons, but they would use their butt ends to beat the Chinese with. Some would not beat a Chinese, but rob him of whatever he had and let him go, yelling to him to go quickly. Some, who took no part in either beating or robbing the Chinese, stood by, shouting loudly and laughing and clapping their hands. All told, at least 29 Chinese were murdered by the mob. Some were burned alive in their home while they tried to hide. Others were dragged out and mutilated. All but one of the 80 homes belonging to Chinese families in the area were burned to the ground. According to at least one account, one of the Chinese miners' penis and testicle were cut off and taken to a nearby saloon to be displayed as quote, a trophy of the hunt. Rather than shock the country, the event seemed to be a catalyst toward validating further violence. A few days later, on September 7th, in the Squaw Valley of Washington, a group of white and Native American workers fired into the tents of Chinese workers, killing 3 of them. All across the West, Chinese miners were robbed and their houses burned, their families expelled from mining camps. On September 28, 1885, an anti-Chinese Congress met in Seattle, with Tacoma, Washington's mayor presiding. This group proclaimed that all Chinese people must leave the western Washington area by November 1st of that year. On October 3rd, they met to set up an ouster committee, which sent out letters to members of the Chinese community stating they must leave the city of Tacoma by November 1st. On October 31st, the night before the deadline, a rally was held, with nearly 700 people coming to participate in the expulsion. 150 of the Chinese residents of Tacoma had fled, but 200 remained. No actions were taken on November 1st, but when those accused of the murder in the Squaw Valley were acquitted of all charges on November 2nd, many in the town took that as to mean they could act against the Chinese with impunity. On November 3rd, a mob of nearly 500 began rounding up all the Chinese who remained in the city, often breaking into their homes and dragging them outside. The mob forced them to march 8 miles in the pouring rain to the Lakeview train station. Once at the station, they were forced to buy a train ticket to Portland. Those without the money were forced to ride in boxcars or walk the 140 miles along the railroad track. At least 2 people died of exposure while waiting for the trains. On November 4th, the headline of the Tacoma Daily Ledger was, "Gone. 200 Chinese leave the city. How the people's request was enforced." On November 7th, a celebration ball was held in Tacoma. That same day, the mayor, the fire chief, and 25 others were indicted, becoming known as the Tacoma 27. Community members cheered as they left to face the charges in Vancouver on November 9th, and by the 12th, thanks to a legal fund paid for by the community, all 27 had been released on bail and returned to the community, where they were reportedly greeted with great fanfare. The trial stalled for over a year before the charges were fully dropped on a technicality. In February of 1886, a similar expulsion was attempted in Seattle. A mob forced 350 Chinese down to the city docks, where they intended to force them onto ships going back to China. Federal troops were able to intervene to put down the riot, but about 150 Chinese people decided to leave out of fear. Mob violence against Chinese took place all throughout Washington state, in Portland, Oregon, and in California. In 1887, 34 Chinese miners were ambushed and murdered in Wallowa County over several days. Despite one of the men involved giving a full confession to the crimes, none involved were convicted. In 1892, when the 10 years of the Chinese Exclusion Act was set to expire, it was instead extended and strengthened with the Geary Act. This act added the provision requiring all Chinese residents to carry papers at all times, with the punishment of either deportation or a year of hard labor if they failed to. In 1902, the Chinese Exclusion Act was made permanent. In 1917, In 1924, it was expanded to include other Asian immigrants groups, such as the Japanese. In 1943, the total ban on Chinese immigration was lifted as part of the Magnuson Act. This act was part of an alliance with China during World War II against Japan and only allowed for 105 visas. In many states, Chinese Americans, including some U.S. citizens, were still denied property ownership rights until the Magnuson Act was itself repealed in 1865 and national origin formulas were abolished. History is awkward.
Los Angeles, the City of Angels, has a storied history. While today it is the second largest city in the United States with a population of nearly 4 million, in 1870 its population was just 5,728. And according to the United States Census Bureau, of those, 179 were Chinese. Chinese immigration to the United States began in earnest during the California Gold Rush, but the clash between people who had a different appearance and a different culture always resulted in racial tension. And one terrible night in 1871, those racial tensions boiled over into what was at the time called Black Tuesday, or the Night of Horrors, but what today is usually called the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre. And the victims of that massacre deserve to be remembered. Early Chinese immigration to the United States began with maritime trade, but the first great wave began in the middle of the 19th century as Chinese immigrants came to work in the California gold fields or building the Transcontinental Railroad. Many were seeking a better life with higher wages to either send back to the extended families they left behind in China or to take back with them when they returned home. Some were seeking to escape the violence of the Bloody Taiping Rebellion. In 1848, the U.S. Census showed a total of 325 Chinese Americans. In 1880, that number was 300,000. By the 1860s, there was a significant Chinese minority living in the frontier city called Los Angeles, and many Chinese families lived on a street called Calle de los Negros. Calle de los Negros, in Los Angeles' former Chinatown district, was originally named for the Spanish men who frequented the street. The colloquial English version of the street name, which can be viewed on some of the city's older maps, is a racial slur. In 1871, it was lined with shops, saloons, brothels, and even a doctor's office. Though the street itself was only 500 feet long, it had a large reputation for violence. A Los Angeles Times article talking about the history of the street, published in 1898, said that the Calle de los Negros had been the wickedest street on earth. But it wasn't always such a dark destination and had seen better days. The street was once home to wealthy Californio families, the remains of the Spanish landowners in California.
Day 1, month 3, month 6, forever. These 4 milestones represent my...
Los Angeles itself was a rough and tumble western city. For example, the first publicly funded building constructed in the city of Los Angeles was a jail. It also smelled. The ditches around the city served as multi-purpose latrines, laundry areas, and wallows for hogs. The Los Angeles News wrote about the conditions in the city in October 1869. Dead dogs and cats with rotten fruit, slops, and decaying vegetables lie promiscuously about and pass undisturbed through the successive stages of decomposition, making a picture of supreme nastiness. The dirt roads lining the city could turn into swamps after rainstorms in which travelers could sink into mud up to 2 feet deep. And Los Angeles could be a dangerous and violent place. In the 1850s, the city had a homicide rate of 12.4 per thousand people, still the record for the highest per capita homicide rate in U.S. history. There was an average of a murder a day, and the killings largely took place around the gambling dens and saloons of the Calle de los Negros, often driven by long-standing grudges or gambling disputes. It didn't help matters that the Los Angeles Police Department was incredibly small. When it was first established as a paid rather than a volunteer force in 1869, the department consisted of only 6 men for a violent city of roughly 6,000 people. Perhaps because of the small number of police officers, California generally had a history of vigilante justice. Committees would form to take matters into their own hands, and those committees could often turn into mobs, as they did the night of October 24th, 1871. That night, police officer Jesus Bilderin heard shots coming from the Calle de los Negros. He and his partner, Esteban Sanchez, jumped on their horses and rode to the dispute. They discovered 5 or 6 Chinese men firing at one another in the street. Bilderin tried to break up the fight, but then the duelists turned their pistols on him, and he was shot in the shoulder. Chinese immigrants in Los Angeles were often members of social groups called the Huiguan, commonly called companies in the newspapers at the time, although that translation is not exactly correct. Huiguan were social groups formed to help Chinese immigrants in their new lives in America. Members would sign up for the Huiguan based on the location they immigrated from in China. These groups would help with everything from finding their members jobs to offering loans and helping care for the sick. If the person died, the Huiguan would help transport the member's body back to his or her family in China. The violence started in the Calle de los Negros that evening because of a fight between 2 Chinese men who were members of different Huiguan who had developed a feud. The feud had become so heated that one merchant said that the local Chinese residents, numbering only around 200, had purchased between 40 and 50 pistols from his store in the weeks before the shootout. The noise had alerted other citizens of Los Angeles to the fight, and they gathered around the Calle de los Negros to see if they could lend assistance. Robert Thompson, a former saloon owner, was among the crowd. Someone yelled, "The Chinamen have shot Bilderin!" Thompson drew his gun and approached one of the shops where some of the shots were coming from. As he fired into the open doorway, a shot came from those within and struck him above the heart. Eyewitnesses later said that Thompson choked out, "I'm killed." He eventually bled to death hours later, but the shooting of Thompson and Bilderin changed the mood of the watching crowd. A mob of an estimated 500 people of different nationalities attacked the Chinese living in the city. The general public opinion was driven by resentment and distrust of Chinese immigrants. While often portrayed as a working-class complaint over jobs, the hatred towards the Chinese was a thinly veiled racism against a people who were hated largely because their ways and culture were different. Newspapers supported the racist attitudes, and Los Angelinos blamed the Calle de los Negros for crime in their city. It did not take much to incite a mob against the residents there. Between the sheriff, city marshal, and police officers, there were only 9 lawmen available that night to control the crowd. They deputized some of the citizens and ordered everyone to keep the Chinese from leaving the Calle de los Negros, particularly the Coronel Apartments, named after their owner, a former Los Angeles mayor and California state treasurer, Antonio F. Coronel. You wouldn't call the Coronel Apartments a nice place to live. The Chinese immigrants who lived on the Calle de los Negros in the Coronel Adobe Apartments lived there because it was all they could afford. The men who had started the gunfight in the street fled the scene, and the inflamed mob descended on the innocent Chinese families, some of whom were sitting down to dinner in the Coronel. When the mob couldn't get to the people in the Adobe building, they climbed up on the roof and dug holes through where they could shoot down at their helpless victims. One man, a man named Ah Wing, panicked and tried to run away. The mob ran him down and lynched him from the gate of a lumber yard. Meanwhile, back in the Calle de los Negros, the mob had grown impatient. There was talk of setting fire to burn the Coronel to the ground, but that idea was set aside. Only 2 weeks before that night, the city of Chicago had experienced a devastating fire that had burned out of control and destroyed a large part of the city. Los Angeles did not want to suffer the same fate. Using a large stone, the mob eventually broke down the doors and went through the building, apartment by apartment, dragging the Chinese people out into the street. The violence and brutality was terrible. One of the victims was Dr. Jing Tong, who was a popular Chinese physician. Dr. Tong swore to the crowd he had nothing to do with the earlier gunfight and promised to give his life savings to the mob if they let him go. They shot him through the mouth and then hanged him. Eyewitnesses to the violence claim men were pouring into the Calle de los Negros from the suburbs of Los Angeles, bearing rifles, shotguns, and pistols. In some quarters, the mood was almost a celebration, with one man dancing as he pulled the rope. Another report had a young boy clamoring for more victims while helping the older men pull the innocent ones to their death. 3 of the victims, 2 men and a Chinese boy of only 15 years old, were returning from their jobs to their homes in the Calle de los Negros when they were caught by the mob. They didn't even know a shooting had taken place when they were lynched from an awning outside of a wagon shop. While the killings were going on, looters ransacked the homes and shops of the Calle de los Negros. There was a rumor that one of the shops contained a chest full of gold. That was untrue, but looters ripped through possessions in a fury, trying to discover it. When the evening was over, nearly 10% of Los Angeles' Chinese population was shot to death or lynched. Experts argue that the more than 18 people who were killed in the 1871 riots and lynchings were killed largely because they didn't have a voice, being marginalized members of society. Chillingly, members of the mob seemed to think that the violence against the Chinese was fun. To be fair, not everybody in Los Angeles participated in the riots. Some tried to shame the mob into stopping, and others hid Chinese people in their homes to keep them safe. One man named William H. Gray hid several people in his home, and he said for years thereafter he would receive anonymous gifts in thanks for what he had done. Despite the killing, no charges of murder were brought. 9 men were eventually tried and found guilty of manslaughter for their roles in the lynchings and murders, and sentenced to between 2 and 6 years, but their sentences were eventually overturned by the California Supreme Court on a technicality. When news of the Night of Horrors was published in newspapers in places like New York and Chicago, it was the first time that many of the citizens of those cities had ever heard of the tiny city of Los Angeles. Editorials skewered the city, saying there was nothing angelic about it. City leaders were so embarrassed by the publicity that they took steps to implement effective law and order, and among those steps in 1877 was to rename the infamous Calle de los Negros, calling it instead Los Angeles Street. The massacre in Los Angeles took place more than 10 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a federal law that prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers. This law was one of the first to restrict immigration into the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act highlighted racial tensions at the time and would not be repealed until the 1960s. The exact number of people killed by the mob that night is still unknown. After an initial burial in the United States, the bodies of the victims were returned to their families in China. The cemetery where they were initially buried doesn't exist anymore. Many of their names are lost to history. And the tensions that can turn a crowd into a mob still exist today. The city of Los Angeles has a long history of racial violence. 34 people were killed in race riots in Los Angeles in 1965, and another 62 were killed in race riots in 1992.
I've been iller than the average. When niggas know that I got the flows, I'm a savage. I know cause I bite down you quick like a sandwich. I let the niggas have it cause they know how I handle it and bring it back. My nigga, you know that I'll be back with it. John back with it. My nigga sick, yeah, I'm back with this. If you got the flow, but your flow needs to speed it. Cause the shit stink real must smell like pink pussy in the dark. But I'm back, nigga, with the spark rolling up a blunt. But I'm floating like nose off. If you wanna go with me, nigga, know I gotta go, but I gotta get it in quick. I don't eat pork. If you like to see that shit on your fork, you can die like a motherfucker, but you can live. You can move around, homeboy, in the order you give. But I'll be back, motherfucker, and I'm bleeding like a shit. I see what you mean. Cause everything going on, you know it's wrong. Another day, another song. Good luck, Joe. Looking like a UFC, he didn't believe Ain't back flabbergasted, my niggas been moving around, they full of ass kiss, but I'm more like running through your lying dick buckets. Let you have it real quick with the rough and rugged, the ruckus.